listening to Cooper Talk.
Welcome to Cooper Talk. I'm your host, Steve Cooper, and remember, I'm only as hip as my guests. And I'm going to tell you, we have a great show today. We have a gentleman who is not only in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for his work with Genesis, but as a solo artist, he's recorded, I believe it's 26 albums. I may be wrong, it might be 25, but his work is amazing. He's a legend, and my guest is Steve Hackett. How you doing, Steve?
Very well, thank you. Nice to talk to you, Steve.
Nice to talk to you. Now, I got to ask you, you started your career off with Genesis. How did they find you?
Well, in those days, we used to advertise ourselves in the back of a trade magazine called Melody Maker. And a lot of British bands were formed that day. A lot of bands that became very big were kicked off that way. So, yeah, that was all important. The magazine doesn't exist anymore, but some of the bands that were formed from those back pages are still around.
So you answer an ad for that, and then you join the band, and then your career just starts to take off.
Yeah, well, you know, it was 5 years of ads in the back of that magazine, and so it wasn't entirely instant, and it took a while for the band to take off. Yeah, you know, it was a slow burn. Genesis was a slow burn at first, especially in the States. People didn't always understand what we were doing. It wasn't really straight ahead rock. It was a lot more subtle and very, very British, very eccentric. But luckily, it happened in the end. Now,
I've read that you didn't pick the guitar up till around you were 12 years old. How did you become such an amazing guitarist, be someone who influenced Eddie Van Halen and Alex Lifeson and a bunch of people? What was your course? Did you just practice all the time, or how did your music talent just blossom?
Well, you know, I was playing harmonica 10 years before that, so ever since I was 2, I was trying to make noises on the harmonica just like my dad, and then guitar started to interest me when I was 12, and I was still a little bit too small to get my arms around my dad's guitar. By the time I was 14, I was trying to work out chords instead of just single lines on the 2 bass strings. Ever since then, you know, that was a very that early guitar had a brutal action on it and really, really heavy strings. But then a friend of mine had a nylon-strung guitar, and that seemed so easy by comparison. So over time, I got interested in nylon work just as much as electric.
So did you pick it up very fast as you were developing? Like by the time you were in Genesis, because I know you had a influence on some of Genesis' sound, because I believe they were like more of a bluesy band, and you brought more of the progressive prog rock into it. How did you find that voice when you played guitar?
Well, you know, it's a very difficult thing to say. I think what happened was I was very interested in blues guitar and blues harmonica. Loved all of that, and then I think music started to change towards the end of the 1960s. The influence of the Beatles, of course, working with orchestras and with George Martin, and the Indian influence meant that rock and pop, it was becoming a much broader palette, and people that had been influenced by jazz were becoming involved with bands, and also the influence of classical music and the use of harmony was becoming a very big deal. So there were several bands that mixed all of that. British bands in the main, and Genesis was a band full of guys who were all into different things. I mean, Phil Collins loved big band stuff, and Mel Torme, Buddy Rich. Pete was into he liked bluesy stuff, and I guess there were quite a lot of black singers that he was influenced by, and Mike Rutherford tended to like folk music in the main, Judy Collins, that kind of stuff. Tony Banks, it was really Classical music, I think, had been a very big thing. Shostakovich, I know he mentioned, and I believe that his mother played classical piano as well. So I suspect he probably had all the lessons and all of that. But I think that he very early on he liked to try and write his own things. Once he found he could work out the chords to most of the Beatles tunes, I think there was no stopping him. So I think he had probably the most developed sense of harmony of all of us.
Now, what do you think helped break Genesis in America? Because I remember, the early work, everyone loved it, and it was different. What do you think helped break you guys over here?
Well, I think the lead singer at that time was Peter Gabriel, and once he started to incorporate theatrics with the show, that really changed the audience perception, and suddenly media had something that they could write about, because much of the music was the same. We might have been playing some of that music, 2 years before it really took off, but by the time he was really depicting the action or living the songs live, you had something that was similar in a way, I think, to perhaps what Bowie was doing, and Alice Cooper, of course, in the States, put on a great show, was a great showman. But I think that Pete, had that ability to not just sing but act and tell stories. And so I think that the band represented all things British. By the time we were doing Selling England by the Pound, I think the band had found a focus, and so wherever we played internationally, we were apparently selling England. We were. I think we were nailing our colours to the mast. We were all things British and eccentric and weird and kind of strange. Most of us sat down to play at that time, and Pete leapt around everywhere around the stage, and thank God he did. The rest of us were all kind of head down, just getting on with the music.
Now, you wrote some with Genesis, and of course you've had so many solo albums that you write a lot. When did you start writing music?
I think just before Genesis. I was with a band called Quiet World a year before Genesis, and whilst the other guys, when I joined them, they already had a recording contract. There were three brothers, the Heather brothers. They were all, writing the stuff, but occasionally I'd kick in with things, and writing started pretty early on for me. I also befriended during that time Ian MacDonald, who had just left King Crimson and was about to do a solo album along with Michael Giles. So MacDonald and Giles, he just was making that album when I befriended him, and he said he liked the stuff that I was playing with the band, and and then of course he was due to very shortly form Foreigner. So by the time we were touring with Genesis in the States, very very early days, Foreigner had just been formed, and they were having a hit with "Feels Like the First Time." I think was their first single.
Now, in some of the Genesis songs, your guitar solos are incorporated. How does that come up in the writing process? Do you have input on that and say, if someone else writes a song and you say, I think there should be a solo there? Or do they know how you play and how good you are that they would just sit there and write that solo for you?
Well, no, what tended to happen was when I first joined, Pete said to me, we work as a songwriters collective, like a songwriters co-op, and he said as soon as you write the guitar part, you're basically a fully fledged, fully paid up member of the writing team. And so the emphasis with Genesis in those days was not so much freestyle, but the idea of having a written melody, so that when you soloed, you had a certain standard that the show wasn't going to fall below. So Genesis was very much concerned with this idea of form and many of the other bands that I've been involved with, sort of blues type stuff. The spirit was more to the fore, whereas Genesis, it was very much more, you've got to have the form to the stuff, so you had to either write or learn how to write.
Now, Eddie Van Halen credited, said you're one of his influences, and I believe you started the double tap. How did you become innovative on the guitar? What made you play differently than other people who were playing at that time?
Well, we did an album called Selling England by the Pound in 1973, and say, for instance, the first track was called Dancing with the Moonlit Night. Now, there's a guitar solo in that which features tapping, and it features sweep picking and octave jumps. It's all actually in one prototype solo, and all of those things have become, part of the dictionary of shredders and heavy metal, more so that than really progressive. But I don't know how that happened. I was looking for things to play that were different to everyone else, and Eddie Van Halen credits me with inventing that. So he named it. I was playing it, and many of those techniques didn't have names when I was first doing them, and they were things that came naturally to me.
So Genesis is popular by this time. They're getting very popular. You're recording albums. What made you the decision to leave? I know you recorded your first solo album when you were with Genesis, but what made you? What gave you the decision to decide to leave Genesis? Because a lot of people would sit there and go, "I'm part of a huge band. I'm going to stay."
Yep.
What made you decide to do it? And kudos to you, because a lot of people wouldn't have done it.
Yeah. Well, I think I had a hit album with Voyage of the Acolyte, the first one, and I think when you have a hit and you are a member of a band that is a very competitive band, it's ironic, that Mike Rutherford actually helped me on the album, and so did Phil. But once it took off, the accusations started to fly in terms of you're not giving everything to the band, and I said, well, if you give me a sort of a guaranteed slice of the writing, I can maybe submerge all my kind of solo stuff, but I don't want to just be hired by you guys, and that wasn't acceptable. The idea of having a parallel solo career wasn't acceptable. And it was the same thing with Pete. Pete wanted to have a separate solo career, and Mike and Tony were not keen on him doing that, and they were not keen on me having a parallel solo career. But, when you've had a hit album on your own, your record company, or record companies as it would, the pressure was on, like, can we have the next one from you? And at that time, suddenly when you're captain of your own ship, even for a short time, it's difficult to go back to being a member of the crew, even though with a band like Genesis, of course, I joined on the basis of being, a full member and an equal writing partner. But I think that's not quite how it worked out. When I was being dictated to by some of the founder members. So that's the God's honest truth.
So you leave. It's the late 70s. You're on your own. Are you now feeling a little bit, not nervous, but you already had a hit record, but now you don't have Genesis to fall back on. So now it's just, balls to the walls for you. What's going through your mind when you have to do that second record, because your first one was a hit, you're on your own now. What's going through your mind as an artist and with your writing ability?
Well, I wanted to make an album, the second album. I wanted it to be like one of those early CBS sampler albums. They had a bunch of albums called The Rock Machine Loves You, and at that time, you know, they had Simon and Garfunkel and the Zombies and the Grateful Dead, and they put all these artists side by side on this sampler album because they had a great roster of acts. And I wanted to do a personal album that sounded like it was coming from a number of different artists. So I worked with an extremely varied vocal team, Richie Havens, Steve Walsh of Kansas, Phil Earhart of Kansas, Randy Crawford, and so I did an album that was extremely varied, and it was something that many years later Stephen Wilson said to me that was hugely influential for him. He found that, you know, the variety of things on it, things that were part fusion, many different styles, and that second album actually was a lot harder because, as you say, I was without the band. But by the time I'd done the third album, I had a touring band, and I had 3 albums to draw from, plus anything of Genesis that I wanted to throw in there. So gradually, things started to take shape.
Well, you know, you've been around, you've gone through many different generations. When you hit the 80s, what do? Do you stick to your guns and your musical vision, or do you sit there and think, you know, the sounds, the songs, what we hear is all changing?
There was a sense of everything changing, and I remember meeting Steve Howe and talking about, you know, the way things were on the change, and we decided to form a band together and call it GTR, short for guitar, and we luckily were signed to Arista Records with Clive Davis, and we had a gold album, we had a hit single with When the Heart Rules the Mind, and luckily MTV was prepared to get behind us big time, and so every hour or so you got, you know, this single on there. We had a band of younger guys. We were 2 vets by that time, and a bunch of young guys who were playing and singing with us, and the album did very well. So there was a response to what happened in the 80s, and we started to have the occasional hit single because companies were very concerned with the shift from albums-based acts to singles-based. The fact that you had video, the fact that you had MTV, it reigned supreme at that time. Of course, people like me, we're really keen on making albums. That's the whole thing. So I didn't really come out of a singles-based culture. The 1970s was really all about albums. It was all about the journey that the songs took you on, and I still feel the same way. I'm not averse to having the occasional hit single, and I have done, but in the main, I think the value of a really great album, I think, has got to outweigh any effect of having even a massive hit single.
When you attack the idea of an album, because I'm an album person. You know, I love looking at the cover art and looking at the track selections. When you write, and you've done over 25 albums, I believe. I don't know if it's 25 or 26. I was counting, and I got thrown off. I was like, wait, is this one or is this one? But when you do an album, even from then and to this day, do you sit there and plan it and write it so you know your listener and your fans will appreciate it to the utmost?
Well, I think nobody sits down and tries to make an album that doesn't appeal to people. I think that you need to strike a balance between being true to yourself and having an idea what an audience might actually like. So, for instance, with the latest album, I really love orchestras working with bands, and we've used a lot of orchestras, a lot of orchestral textures, and and the influence of world music, so that there's nothing wrong with someone playing the duduk from Armenia, or the tar from Azerbaijan, and sitar from India. And so the albums I do tend to be full of this kind of stuff, as well as rock as we know it. So the idea is to try and broaden the music as much as possible, and to try and tell a story with each tune, I think.
Now, when do you know it's time for another album? Because, I looked through your career. You had some that was like you had 2 in 1 year. You had some that's like a year difference. Some there's 3 years. How do you do that creative process where you sit there and go, do you just sit there and go, it's time for another album, I'm going to start writing again? Or do you put yourself on a schedule?
Well, I think what tends to happen is there'll be one song will come first of all. Normally, I think you need 2 phrases or 2 chords and some sort of friction between the two, some kind of link, some kind of DNA cable or something like that. Something has got to spark your interest to complete a whole song, and it's usually a powerful phrase that you can't ignore. And then I find that I build outwards from that. So I'll be thinking, oh, this is a perfect song, and then I'll be thinking, oh, well, maybe it could have an introduction to the song proper, and it might extend to involve solos or other sections, so I can extend it from that initial spark forwards or backwards. And I think once you've done one thing, you tend to dream up whatever else might go with it. It's a bit like dreaming up a family, and you think, oh, we've got some aunts and uncles here, and it needs a few cousins, and there's no way of really describing the songwriting process. It's a magical process. Things just pop into your head when you least expect it, and what I do is I write things down all the time on paper. I tend to work on paper. That's the way I remember things. So I might be on an aeroplane heading off somewhere, and if I get an idea, it goes straight down on paper. If it still haunts me long enough, it turns into a song.
Now, you said you can't really explain the songwriting process, but you've been writing, from your first solo album to now, you're looking at that's over 40 years. Through the years, has your writing process, has your writing process changed in with what you write about?
Well, I think the process has changed. I do write quite a bit with my wife, Jo. Often we'll kick around a lyrical idea between us. It might be something that comes from me, or it might be from her. Like, for instance, one of the tracks on the latest album is about India, and I've been to India, but Jo has been twice. She was there before me, and the song Shadow and Flame is really about her experience of watching the light come up over the Ganges in a place called Varanasi. A very, very beautiful place as the light's coming up with candles and bathers, but at the same time, there are bodies floating down the river, because that's the way it works out there. And so we wanted something that reflected both the mystical and the spiritual side of India, but also the hustle and bustle of Mumbai and such places. So the whole song is a kind of it's a little bit like a film, but for the ear rather than the eye.
Now, the latest album came out, and now I believe you're starting your tour in 2 weeks. I believe is it in Norway? No, I know it's somewhere in Europe.
We start off in Ostend. We kick off in Ostend. Yeah.
Now, what can people expect to hear when they come to see you? Do you like to concentrate on a lot of the new album? Because I'm sure you're very proud of it. It's something that, you put it out, so you have to like it. What do you like to give your audiences when you go start touring?
Well, this time I'm going to be doing part of what I do. It's part solo, but it's also a part Genesis. I've divided, the show up into 2 halves in a way, where we feature the solo stuff, we feature the Genesis stuff. Now, this time I'm going to feature things from 3 albums. It's going to be the whole of Selling England by the Pound, that 1973 album that piqued John Lennon's interest in us. Plus, I'll be including a track that was part of those writing sessions but didn't make it onto the album, which is something that Peter Gabriel wrote, and then I finished it off many years later with his cooperation and blessing. A track called Deja Vu. We'll be doing that one. So we do the complete Selling England by the Pound with that deleted scene in it, which is important to me. And we're going to do quite a bit of Spectral Mornings, which is an album I was involved with, solo album, the year 1979. And I'll also do stuff from the new album, At the Edge of Light. So it's going to focus on 3 albums.
Now, is it not weird, but is it something different because you played some of that Genesis stuff so early in your career with Genesis, now you're playing it with different musicians. How does that gel for you for stage, or are you just, you know what you do and people are there to see you? How does that work?
Well, I think that many of the guys that I've worked with who are hugely talented, these guys are a bit younger than me, and they grew up listening to the Genesis stuff, so they've been hugely influenced by it. And it makes it much easier to do very authentic renditions of these songs, very authentic, but to take them a stage further from time to time. Hopefully to do everything that's iconic about those songs, but then to extend things and not just do little sort of brief bits with segues and with a brief nod to the 70s. We want to give people the full picture and some things that they perhaps didn't expect with that as well. So you get everything that you had at one time and more. Because I'm very proud of this early work, and I think that particular album I've noticed is a lot of people's favorite Genesis album. It's certainly mine, and there are many great Genesis albums, I think, but that one somehow encapsulates a time when we were still striving like crazy to make our mark, and luckily John Lennon responded very positively to us and said that we were one of the bands that he was listening to at the time. So even though I've left the band in a way, and of course there is no Genesis right now, it's the nearest thing to that experience, and so I revisit that. I've done 2 albums with it, which have revisited that Genesis time with lots of guests on it, and many of them are very well known, and it's been marvelous to do it and orchestrate it further, so band and orchestra. I've sometimes toured with orchestra as well, and it's a very interesting time because you get the best of the past and you know, all respect with that, and but also to keep making new albums and still to be passionate about it, which is my other thing. So we have to move forward at the same time, keep the museum doors open. Exactly.
I know you have to go because you have another interview, but real quick, I want to ask you, what was your experience when you got inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and are you happy that you had that such an honor that you'll go down in music history?
Well, you know, I think it's a great thing that you have in the States, which is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We don't really have any equivalent of that in England, and indeed not really in the rest of the world. But the nice thing about that is that, you know, sometimes people will be inducted, if not in their lifetime, eventually it's as if people receive medals. And I was thrilled that, you know, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band was inducted a while back, and yes, unfortunately it didn't happen within the lifetime of my great friend Chris Squire, who was such an influence on bass players and progressive music, you know, throughout the world. But eventually, time has a habit of catching up, and so I think if anyone does something really extraordinary and they stuck to their guns, there's a chance that they will be honoured. So, you know, there were people at that show, at that evening, who were, they were Genesis contemporaries. There were guys who were older, who were getting up and doing it, and, you know, Jimmy Cliff, and was sounding in great voice, and ABBA were inducted the same night, and speeches by people like David Geffen, and Michael Douglas was in the audience. My God, it was, the whole thing was star-studded, and I had a chance to give a little speech, and I thought it was absolutely wonderful and very, very emotional evening. Once everyone, realized that it didn't just have to be a stuffed shirt affair, I felt that the emotional temperature of everybody was just going up and up and up as the night progressed, and it was a genuine response to people who got up and performed.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time. Your tour, you're touring, and then you come to America. I know you're playing in my area in September for 2 shows at the Keswick Theater, which is a great little place to play. And I want to thank you. And people, check out Steve's website. It's hackettsongs.com. And check him out on Twitter. It's official Hackett. And I'm Steve Cooper. I'm only as hip as my guest. Don't forget, drink your water, eat your vegetables, take your vitamins, and have a great day.